December 7th, 1941. The harbor at Pearl Harbor still burned when Japanese pilots returned to their carriers, flush with victory, their aircraft riddled with minor damage from scattered defensive fire. In the ready rooms, over sake and cigarettes, they spoke of the American bombers they had glimpsed on the ground. Enormous four-engine machines, ungainly and slow, parked in neat rows like cattle awaiting slaughter. The Boeing B-17, they had been told, was called the Flying Fortress. The name provoked quiet laughter. A fortress that flies is still just a target, one pilot remarked. Americans, it seemed, had confused size with strength, weight with invincibility. The Imperial Navy had destroyed 5 of these fortresses on the ground at Hickam Field, their aluminum skin peeling away under cannon fire like paper. The war in the Pacific, Japanese intelligence assured their airmen, would be won before these lumbering giants could ever prove their worth. But 3 days later, on December 10th, a single B-17D named San Antonio Rose appeared over the invasion fleet off the Philippines. It flew at 18,000 feet beyond the effective ceiling of most Zero fighters. It dropped its bombs with methodical precision, turned in a wide arc, and vanished into the clouds. Zeros scrambled, climbed, fired, and watched it disappear. The laughter began to fade. By early 1942, the myth of the Flying Fortress had calcified into Japanese tactical doctrine. American heavy bombers were slow, yes, cruising at 180 miles per hour with a full bomb load. They were large, yes, presenting a target profile that seemed to fill the sky. But the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, veterans of China and the opening campaigns of the Pacific War, had learned to respect size. Large aircraft carried large bomb loads. Large aircraft, if properly defended, could absorb damage that would obliterate a fighter. And the B-17 they discovered was defended with a philosophy that bordered on obsession. 13 Browning M2 .50 caliber machine guns bristled from every angle: nose, dorsal turret, ventral ball turret, waist positions, tail. Each gun fired 750 rounds per minute, each bullet weighing nearly 2 ounces, each capable of tearing through an aircraft engine block at 600 yards. The Americans had not built a bomber. They had built a flying gun platform that happened to carry explosives. And in the skies over the Pacific, where fighter escorts were rare and distances vast, this distinction would mean everything. The first true test came in the waters near Rabaul, New Britain, in early 1943. Japanese intelligence had tracked a formation of B-17Es from the 43rd Bombardment Group as they lumbered toward the harbor, where troop transports clustered like feeding fish. The sortie should have been a massacre. 18 Zeros rose to meet them, their pilots experienced, their tactics proven over Guadalcanal and Port Moresby. They approached from the standard angle, 12 o'clock high, diving through the formation to rake the cockpits and engines before the cumbersome bombers could react. The first Zero disintegrated at 400 yards, struck by converging fire from 3 nose guns. The second lost its tail section to the dorsal turret. The third made it through the formation, but emerged trailing smoke, its pilot slumped forward, killed by a single round through the canopy. The Zeros regrouped, circled, tried again. The B-17s flew on, steady as a funeral procession, their formations tight, their gunners calm. When the bombing run completed, all 9 fortresses turned for home. 3 were damaged. None fell. On the carriers that evening, the laughter had stopped entirely. What the Japanese pilots had encountered was not merely a well-armed aircraft, but a philosophy of air combat forged in the doctrinal fires of the U.S. Army Air Corps. The B-17 was born in 1935, designed for a single purpose: to defend the American coastline from enemy fleets by striking them far from shore. Its creators at Boeing had studied the problem methodically. Long-range maritime patrol required endurance, thus 4 engines, thus fuel capacity exceeding 2,400 gallons. High-altitude bombing required stability, thus a wingspan of 103 feet, thus control surfaces designed for steady flight in thin air. Self-defense required firepower, thus the fortress concept. The idea that a formation of bombers could create a zone of interlocking fire so lethal that enemy fighters would be destroyed before they could press home their attacks. In theory, the B-17 needed no escort. In theory, it was its own fortress, mobile and untouchable. The theory the Japanese discovered was not entirely wrong. But theory and practice diverge in the crucible of combat, and the early months of the Pacific War revealed the flying fortress to be less invincible than its name suggested. The B-17C and D models that fought in the Philippines and Java carried fewer guns, just 5 machine guns, some in handheld mounts that required gunners to brace against slipstream and cold. Their armor was light. Their self-sealing fuel tanks, a technology borrowed from European combat experience, were not yet standard. When Zeros caught these early fortresses alone, separated from formation, the results were predictable. On December 14, 1941, a B-17D attacked by 9 Zeros over the Philippines absorbed over 500 rounds of cannon and machine gun fire before crash landing on Mindanao, its crew bloodied but alive. 2 days later, another fortress, struck in the fuel tanks, exploded over Lingayen Gulf, killing all aboard. The fortress could endure, but it was not immortal. Japanese pilots learned to exploit its weaknesses: the blind spot beneath the nose, the vulnerability of the cockpit to head-on attacks, the soft underbelly where the ball turret had not yet been installed. And yet, even in defeat, even burning and falling, the B-17 taught a lesson. It took an extraordinary effort to kill. The Japanese developed tactics accordingly. Standard fighter doctrine against heavy bombers emphasized speed and firepower. Approach fast, fire a concentrated burst at the engines or cockpit, break away before defensive guns could track. But the B-17's cruising altitude, often above 20,000 feet, strained the Zero's engine. The A-6M2, nimble and lethal at lower altitudes, lost performance in thin air. Its 20mm cannon, devastatingly effective against fighters, fired too slowly, just 500 rounds per minute, to saturate a target as large and well-defended as a fortress. Pilots reported needing 20, 30, sometimes 50 hits to bring down a single B-17. The bomber absorbed punishment that would have shattered a formation of Japanese attack aircraft. Its Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, could lose 1, sometimes 2, and still limp home. Its aluminum airframe, reinforced with redundant structural members, bent but rarely broke. Pilots would return from missions with hydraulic lines severed, control cables shot away, entire sections of wing or tail surfaces missing, and still land safely. The Americans, it seemed, had engineered not for elegance but for survival. By mid-1943, the B-17E and F models had arrived in the Pacific theater, and with them came the culmination of the fortress philosophy. The ball turret, a rotating sphere suspended beneath the fuselage, armed with twin 50-caliber guns, closed the ventral blind spot. Additional guns in the nose, operated by the bombardier and navigator, created a forward-facing wall of fire. Armor plating behind the pilot's seats, around the radio operator's position, and beneath the bombardier's station turned the cockpit into a flying bunker. The self-sealing fuel tanks, now standard, could absorb multiple hits without catastrophic fire. And the formation tactics, refined through bitter experience, maximized overlapping fields of fire. A box formation of 18 B-17s, staggered at different altitudes, could bring over 200 machine guns to bear on any approaching fighter. The math was brutal. A Zero attacking such a formation faced a 90% probability of being hit before it could fire. The Japanese called this formation the porcupine. Touch it, and you bled. Yet the true genius of the B-17 lay not in its weapons, but in its resilience, its capacity to absorb catastrophic damage and continue flying. The stories became legend, passed from crew to crew, airfield to airfield, each one more improbable than the last. A fortress named Old Bill returned from a raid on Rabaul with 3 engines dead, its tail nearly severed by cannon fire, held together by control cables and prayer. Another, struck by a Zero in a suicide ram, lost 10 feet of its right wing but landed safely, its pilot coaxing it down with asymmetric thrust and sheer will. In February 1943, a B-17F took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire over Bougainville. The shell penetrated the fuselage, failed to detonate, and lodged in the radio compartment. The crew flew home with a live bomb inside their aircraft, defused it on the runway, and flew the same plane the next day. These were not miracles. They were engineering. Every rivet, every spar, every redundant system had been designed for one purpose: to bring the crew home alive. And against an enemy that prized speed and maneuverability over durability, this philosophy proved devastating. The psychological impact of the flying fortress on Japanese fighter pilots has been understudied by historians, yet it constitutes one of the war's quiet turning points. War is fought as much in the mind as in the sky, and by late 1943, the mind of the average Zero pilot had begun to fracture under the weight of a simple, terrible realization: the Americans could lose bombers and still win. The Japanese could shoot down B-17s. This was proven repeatedly. At Rabaul, at Wewak, at Leh, but each kill required an expenditure of ammunition, fuel, and pilot endurance that bordered on unsustainable. A single fortress might absorb the concentrated fire of 5 Zeros, might take 30 minutes of repeated attacks, might exhaust the fighters' ammunition and force them to break off even as it limped away trailing smoke. And even when a B-17 fell, spinning into the ocean with its crew screaming into their radios, 3 more would appear the next day. The Americans had industrialized air warfare. They had turned bomber production into an assembly line, crew training into a system, loss into an acceptable variable. The Japanese had no answer to this. Consider the mathematics of attrition, the cold calculus that governed the Pacific Air War. In 1943, Boeing's factories in Seattle and Douglas's plant in Long Beach produced a combined total of 6,418 B-17s. That same year, Japan manufactured approximately 3,000 fighter aircraft of all types. The Americans were building heavy bombers, each weighing 30 tons fully loaded, each costing $238,000, each requiring a crew of 10 highly trained men, faster than Japan could build interceptors. And the B-17 was only one type. Consolidated's B-24 Liberator, slightly less robust but longer ranged, added another 6,000 aircraft to the American arsenal. By contrast, Japan's entire heavy bomber program, the G-4M Betty and the G-3M Nell, produced fewer than 2,500 aircraft throughout the war, most of them fragile, underarmed, and vulnerable. The disparity was not merely quantitative but philosophical. American doctrine treated aircraft as expendable tools in service of strategic goals. Japanese doctrine treated aircraft as extensions of the pilot's spirit, to be preserved and honored. When these philosophies collided over the Pacific, the outcome was foreordained. But numbers alone do not explain why the B-17 haunted Japanese airmen. There was something more, something visceral in the experience of attacking a flying fortress. Imagine the approach. Your Zero screaming down from altitude, engine howling, your hand steady on the control column. You align the gun sight, the massive bomber growing in your vision, wings stretching across the sky like the crossbeam of a cathedral. You thumb the firing button. Your 20mm cannon barks, shells arcing toward the target. You see impacts, flashes along the wing, holes punching through the fuselage. The bomber does not flinch. It does not waver. It continues its bombing run as if you do not exist. Then the return fire begins. Tracers, 50 caliber rounds, streams of them converging from turrets you had not even noticed. The air around your cockpit snaps and cracks with supersonic violence. You brake left, diving, your aircraft shuddering from a hit you did not see, fuel streaming from your wing tank, and when you glance back, the fortress is still there, still flying, now joined by 2 others. This was not combat. This was industrial slaughter dressed in the language of aerial warfare. The Japanese response evolved through 3 phases, each more desperate than the last. Phase 1, tactical adaptation. Pilots learned to attack from directly ahead, where the early models had fewer guns, or from directly below, exploiting the blind spot. They coordinated attacks, multiple fighters striking simultaneously from different angles to overwhelm the gunners. They aimed for the engines, the cockpit, the bomb bay doors, critical points where a single lucky hit might trigger catastrophic failure. These tactics worked sometimes. A well-executed frontal attack could shatter a cockpit, killing the pilot instantly. A strike on the number 3 engine, if it ignited the fuel tanks, could tear a wing off. But success was sporadic, and the cost, in ammunition, in fuel, in pilot fatigue, remained punishing. Phase 2, technological escalation. The Japanese introduced the Ki-45. Nick, a twin-engine heavy fighter armed with a 37mm cannon designed explicitly to kill bombers. They experimented with air-to-air rockets with upward-firing cannon with armored attack aircraft. None proved decisive. The B-17 evolved faster than Japanese countermeasures, each new model adding guns, armor, or altitude capability. Phase 3, desperation. By 1944, with conventional tactics failing, some pilots resorted to ramming. It was effective. It was also suicide. The fortress had become a symbol, and symbols in war carry weight beyond their material function. To American air crews, the B-17 represented industrial might, democratic resolve, the promise that their nation's factories could outproduce any enemy. To see a fortress limp home on 2 engines, its fuselage stitched with bullet holes, its crew bloodied but alive, was to witness proof that American engineering could protect American lives. This was not merely propaganda, it was theology. The bomber crews believed in their aircraft with a fervor that bordered on religious. They named their planes Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, Yankee Doodle, and decorated them with nose art that ranged from patriotic to profane. They sang songs about them, wrote letters about them, dreamed about them. And when a fortress went down, when it spiraled into the sea with 10 men screaming inside, the loss was not just tactical, but spiritual. The fortress had failed. The myth had cracked. But for every bomber lost, 10 more arrived, and the myth rebuilt itself. To the Japanese, the B-17 symbolized something darker, the impossibility of victory. Japanese military culture prized individual courage, fighting spirit, the belief that superior morale could overcome material disadvantage. The samurai ethos, translated into aerial combat, held that a skilled pilot in a nimble fighter could defeat any enemy through determination and sacrifice. The Flying Fortress mocked this ethos. It did not matter how brave you were, how skilled, how willing to die. The fortress absorbed your courage and continued. It turned sacrifice into waste. Japanese pilots began to speak of the B-17 in terms once reserved for natural disasters: typhoons, earthquakes, forces beyond human control. One pilot, interviewed after the war, described attacking a formation of fortresses as like trying to sink a battleship with a sword. The image is precise. The Zero was a sword, light, sharp, deadly in the hands of a master. The B-17 was a battleship, slow, heavily armed, indifferent to individual blows. And in the vast theater of the Pacific, where distance is measured in thousands of miles and battles in hours, the battleship won. The emotional toll on Japanese pilots has been largely undocumented, suppressed beneath layers of post-war silence and cultural reticence. But fragments survive in diaries, in letters home, in the occasional interview granted decades later. A Zero pilot named Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces, described his first encounter with a B-17 formation in his memoir. "I thought they would scatter," he wrote. "I thought we would dive among them and they would break apart, each seeking to escape. Instead, they closed ranks. They flew tighter. And the guns never stopped firing. Sakai attacked 6 times, expending all his ammunition, scoring multiple hits. The formation continued. He returned to base, frustrated, empty, aware that he had accomplished nothing." Another pilot, whose name has been lost, wrote to his family in 1943, "The Americans do not fight like us. They do not seek honor. They seek only to destroy, and their machines are very good at destruction." This was not admiration. This was recognition of a chasm that could not be bridged. By 1944, the strategic situation had rendered the question of B-17 vulnerability moot. The Americans had moved beyond the fortress, deploying the B-29 Superfortress, a bomber so advanced, so heavily armed and so high-flying that Japanese fighters could barely reach it. The B-17, now relegated to secondary theaters or transferred to the European front, had served its purpose. It had proven that strategic bombing could be sustained over vast distances, that American industry could replace losses faster than enemies could inflict them. that the Pacific War would be won not through individual heroism, but through overwhelming material superiority. The fortress metaphor had become literal. America had built fortresses in the sky, and Japan had no siege engines capable of breaching them. What remained was the slow, grinding attrition of an empire that could not replace what it lost, facing an enemy that could lose and lose and lose and still advance. The technical specifications of the B-17 read like an engineering manifesto, each number a declaration of intent. Wingspan, 103 feet 9 inches. Length, 74 feet 4 inches. Maximum takeoff weight, 6,500 pounds. Service ceiling, 35,600 feet. Range, 2,000 miles with a 6,000-pound bomb load. 4 Wright R-1820-97 Cyclone turbo-supercharged radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower at takeoff. Cruising speed, 182 miles per hour. Maximum speed, 287 miles per hour. Crew, 10 men, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners. Armament in the G model, the final and most heavily defended variant, 13 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns with 6,280 rounds of ammunition. The statistics alone tell a story, but they do not capture the lived experience of flying this machine into combat, of inhabiting a metal tube at 25,000 feet where the outside temperature dropped to 40 below zero, where oxygen came through a rubber mask that froze to your face, where every breath tasted of hydraulic fluid and fear. The operational reality of a B-17 mission began hours before takeoff, in the pre-dawn darkness of an airfield on Guadalcanal or Espiritu Santo. The crew would gather in the briefing room, a Quonset hut lit by kerosene lamps, its walls covered with maps and reconnaissance photographs. The intelligence officer would outline the target: a Japanese airfield at Rabaul, a shipping convoy near Truk, a supply depot on Bougainville. He would mark the route, the altitude, the expected opposition. The pilots would calculate fuel loads, bomb loads, the trade-off between defensive ammunition and flight endurance. The bombardier would study the target photographs, memorizing terrain features, planning the approach. The gunners would clean their weapons, check the ammunition belts, test the intercom system. And then, in the gray light before sunrise, they would walk to their aircraft, each man carrying his own private weight of dread and determination. The B-17 waited, immense and silent, its aluminum skin beaded with dew, its propellers still. They climbed aboard through the waist hatch, moved to their stations, began the ritual of preparation. The cockpit of a B-17 was organized chaos, a symphony of instruments and controls that required 2 men to operate. The pilot sat on the left, his hands on the control yoke, his feet on the rudder pedals, his eyes scanning the engine gauges, oil pressure, fuel flow, cylinder head temperature, manifold pressure. The co-pilot mirrored his position on the right, reading the checklist, adjusting throttles, monitoring systems. Between them, the throttle quadrant. 4 levers controlling engine power, 4 mixtures controls, 4 propeller pitch levers. Behind them, the flight engineer stood at his panel, watching fuel tanks, electrical systems, hydraulic pressure. The navigator crouched in the nose compartment, bent over his charts and instruments, calculating wind drift and ground speed. The bombardier lay prone in the plexiglass nose, his Norden bomb sight connected to the autopilot, his hand on the bomb release. And throughout the fuselage, the gunners waited at their stations. The dorsal turret gunner perched behind the cockpit. The ball turret gunner curled in his rotating sphere beneath the fuselage. The waist gunners standing at open windows in the freezing slipstream. The tail gunner isolated in his cramped compartment at the aircraft's rear. 10 men, 1 machine, 1 mission. The takeoff sequence was precise, rehearsed, unforgiving. The pilot advanced the throttles, all 4 engines roaring to full power, 4,800 horsepower shaking the airframe. The brakes released. The bomber lurched forward, accelerating slowly, agonizingly, the runway blurring beneath it. At 65,000 pounds, fully loaded with fuel and bombs, the B-17 needed every inch of runway. The pilot held the yoke forward, keeping the tail down until the airspeed indicator crept past 70 miles per hour. Then gently, he pulled back. The nose lifted. The rumbling stopped. The fortress was airborne, climbing ponderously, wheels retracting with a hydraulic groan. The formation assembled over the airfield, 18 aircraft climbing in a slow spiral, finding their positions, tucking into the combat box. The navigator called out the heading. The pilot banked northwest, toward the target, toward the gunfire and the fear. The sun rose behind them. Ahead, the sky was empty. For now, the long hours of flight toward the target were not filled with action, but with tedium laced with terror, a peculiar psychological state that defined strategic bombing. The B-17 droned onward, its engines settling into a steady, hypnotic rhythm that penetrated the crew's skulls and vibrated through their bones. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin and bitterly cold. The crew wore electrically heated flight suits, but the heating elements were unreliable, prone to shorts and failures. Frostbite was common. Men lost fingers and toes to the cold, their flesh turning white and wooden, sensation vanishing. The oxygen masks, essential above 10,000 feet, chafed and leaked. Some men suffered hypoxia without realizing it, their judgment dulling, their vision narrowing to a tunnel. The flight engineer monitored each crew member, watching for the telltale signs: slurred speech over the intercom, erratic behavior, silence where there should be acknowledgement. Hypoxia killed quietly, peacefully, a gentle slide into unconsciousness and death. The cure was simple: switch to a backup oxygen bottle, descend to lower altitude. But in formation over enemy territory, descent was not always possible. The navigator worked constantly, plotting position by dead reckoning and celestial observation. Over the Pacific, there were no landmarks, no roads or rivers to confirm location. There was only water, endless and featureless, and the sun, and if the mission took place at night, the stars. A navigation error of 5 degrees could put the formation 100 miles off course. Could mean arriving over the target with insufficient fuel to return home. Could mean ditching in the ocean with minimal chance of rescue. The navigator checked and rechecked his calculations, called out course corrections to the pilot, worried. The bombardier, meanwhile, studied his target folder, memorizing the approach path, the aiming point, the offset markers he would use to align his bomb sight. The Norden bomb sight was a mechanical computer, a marvel of precision engineering that could calculate wind drift, airspeed, altitude, and trajectory, and release bombs at the exact moment to hit a target the size of a warehouse from 4 miles up. In theory. In practice, the bomb sight was temperamental, sensitive to vibration and cold, and dependent on steady, level flight during the bomb run, a requirement that made the bomber a perfect target for anti-aircraft. Gunners below, the first sign of enemy. Response was usually flak, anti-aircraft fire that burst in. Black puffs around the formation, each explosion sending shrapnel slicing through the air at supersonic speeds. The Japanese used a mix of anti-aircraft guns, 75mm, 80mm, and 120mm weapons, some captured from the British at Singapore, some manufactured domestically. The gunners below calculated altitude, airspeed, and lead time, then fired shells set to explode at a predetermined height. When the shell burst, it released a sphere of jagged metal fragments, each piece capable of tearing through aluminum skin, severing control cables, puncturing fuel tanks, or killing crew members. The flak did not need to score a direct hit. A near miss was often sufficient. The crew in a B-17 could only endure it. They could not evade, could not take defensive action without breaking formation. They flew straight, level through the storm of steel and prayed. Some men counted the bursts. Some recited psalms. Some stared straight ahead, their faces blank, their minds in another place. The noise was apocalyptic. The roar of engines, the crack of explosions, the rattle of shrapnel against the fuselage, the voice of the bombardier over the intercom. Steady, steady. Bomb bay doors open. Bombs away, then the fighters came. The call went out over the intercom. Bandits, 10 o'clock high, and every gunner swung his weapon toward the indicated position. The Japanese fighters appeared as dots on the horizon, growing rapidly into recognizable shapes. The elliptical wings of the Zero, the inline engine of the Ki-61 Tony, the twin fuselages of the Ki-45 Nick. They approached in formation, then split, each fighter selecting a bomber, beginning the attack. The dorsal turret gunner tracked the nearest Zero, his gloved hands gripping the gun controls, his eyes pressed to the reflector sight. The Zero closed, growing from a speck to a silhouette to a machine with visible rivets and a spinning propeller. At 600 yards, the gunner opened fire. The twin .50 calibers hammered, tracers arcing out, the turret filled with the smell of burnt cordite and hot oil. The Zero kept coming. 500 yards. 400. Impacts sparkled along its wing, but it did not break off. 300 yards. The Zero's guns flashed. Cannon shells struck the B-17's wing, tearing holes the size of dinner plates. The dorsal gunner held his trigger down, his guns firing continuously, the barrels glowing red. At 200 yards, the Zero's canopy shattered. The fighter rolled inverted and fell away, trailing smoke. The gunner did not celebrate. 2 more Zeros were already diving from above. The violence of aerial combat compressed time, stretched seconds into subjective hours, reduced the universe to the 6-foot radius around each crew member's station. The ball turret gunner, suspended beneath the bomber in his rotating sphere, watched a Zero approach from below, the one angle the Japanese pilots believed was safe. He rotated his turret, depressing the guns to their maximum angle, and fired a long burst. The Zero tried to break away but was too close, too committed. The .50 caliber round stitched across its fuselage, and it exploded in a bright orange fireball that flashed past the bomber's belly. So close, the gunner felt the heat through his plexiglass enclosure. In the waist, the left gunner engaged a fighter attacking from the beam, firing in short, controlled bursts, conserving ammunition. His training had emphasized fire discipline, a 5-second burst, then reassess, then fire again. But training dissolved under the adrenaline of combat. He held the trigger down, the gun bucking against its mount, shell casings cascading onto the fuselage floor, until the barrel overheated and jammed. He cleared the jam with shaking hands, swearing into his oxygen mask, and resumed firing. The fighter he had been shooting at peeled away, smoking but intact. He did not know if he had hit it, or if the pilot had simply broken off the attack. The tail gunner was the most isolated man on the crew, sealed in his compartment at the rear of the fuselage, unable to see his fellow crew members, unable to move. His station was tiny, barely large enough for his body and his twin guns. He knelt on a padded platform, his face pressed to the gun sight, his hands on the gun controls, watching the tail of the bomber behind and below in the formation. When a Zero attacked from the rear, the classic stern attack, the tail gunner was the last line of defense. A tail gunner's life expectancy, in the heavy bombing campaigns over Europe, averaged 11 missions. In the Pacific, where fighter opposition was less intense but still lethal, the numbers were only slightly better. This tail gunner, a 19-year-old from Nebraska named Bill Harper, had flown 7 missions. He watched a Zero approach from 6 o'clock level, textbook perfect, closing at a combined speed of over 400 miles per hour. Harper waited, his finger resting on the trigger, his breathing slow despite the pounding of his heart. At 800 yards, he fired a ranging burst. Miss. At 600 yards, he fired again, walking his tracers onto the target. The Zero shuddered, struck, but kept coming. At 400 yards, Harper could see the pilot's face, the leather helmet, the white scarf. He fired continuously, both guns pouring rounds into the fighter. The Zero's engine disintegrated. It rolled left and dove, falling away into the clouds below. Harper reported the kill over the intercom, his voice flat, emotionless. Then he vomited into his oxygen mask and nearly suffocated before he could tear it off. The B-17 absorbed damage in ways that defied logic and engineering expectation. A 20-millimeter cannon shell penetrated the fuselage just aft of the radio compartment, passing through the structure without hitting any critical systems or crew members, and exited through the opposite side. The bomber flew on. Another shell struck the number 2 engine, severing fuel lines and igniting a fire. The pilot pulled the fire suppression handle, flooding the engine nacelle with carbon dioxide. The fire went out. He feathered the propeller, adjusting throttle on the remaining 3 engines to compensate. The formation slowed but held together. A third shell exploded inside the bomb bay, shrapnel shredding the hydraulic lines that controlled the landing gear and flaps. Red fluid streamed from the belly of the aircraft, freezing into rust-colored icicles. The flight engineer noted the failure, calculated alternatives. They could lower the gear manually using the emergency crank, They could land without flaps, coming in faster and hotter, but it was survivable. Every system in the B-17 had been designed with redundancy, with the assumption that something would fail, that damage was inevitable. The bomber did not need perfection to survive. It only needed enough. The bombing run itself lasted less than 3 minutes, but those minutes distilled the entire purpose of the mission into a single, irreversible act. The bombardier, lying prone in the nose, took control of the aircraft through the autopilot connected to his Norden bomb sight. The pilot's hands left the yoke. The bomber flew itself, guided by the bombardier's adjustments as he aligned the crosshairs on the target below. The Japanese airfield at Rabaul appeared in his sight: runways, revetments, fuel dumps, parked aircraft. He adjusted for wind, for altitude, for the bomber's drift. The bomb site's gyroscopes whirred, calculating. The intercom crackled. "Steady! 30 seconds! 20 seconds! 10 seconds!" The bomb bay doors were already open, the bombs hanging in their racks, each one a 500-pound general-purpose bomb with a contact fuse. The bombardier pressed the release. The bomber lurched upward, suddenly lighter, as 3 tons of high explosive fell away. The bombs tumbled, stabilized, accelerated earthward. The bombardier watched them fall through his sight, tracking their descent, then called out, "Bombs away!" Bomb bay doors closing. The pilot took control again, banking left, away from the target, away from the flak, heading for home. Behind them, the bombs struck. Smoke and fire blossomed across the airfield. They did not stay to observe the results. They flew west, toward the sea, toward safety, toward the debriefing room and the hot coffee and the weight of what they had done. The return journey transformed the bomber from weapon to sanctuary, a flying refuge that carried wounded men and damaged aircraft across hundreds of miles of hostile ocean. The formation, tighter during the bomb run, now loosened as individual aircraft assessed their damage and calculated their chances. Some bombers, trailing smoke or fuel, dropped out of formation and descended, seeking lower altitude where the air was thicker and breathing easier. Others, their crews uninjured and their systems intact, maintained position, providing cover for the stragglers. The intercom chatter shifted from combat reports to damage assessment. Number 3 engine losing oil pressure. Hydraulic system failure. Landing gear status unknown. Waist gunner hit. Need medical attention. The pilot processed each report, made decisions, calculated fuel consumption against distance remaining. Some decisions were simple: continue home. Others were agonizing: ditch in the ocean and hope for rescue, or attempt to reach a closer island held by Allied forces, or push for home base and risk running out of fuel within sight of the runway. The Japanese fighters, having expended their ammunition and fuel, broke off the engagement. They returned to their bases at Rabaul or Cavien, their pilots exhausted, some wounded, all of them aware that they had failed to stop the bombers. The debriefing sessions on Japanese airfields grew increasingly somber as 1943 progressed into 1944. Pilots reported kills. They had seen B-17s fall, trailing fire, breaking apart in midair, but the intelligence officers noted that American bombing continued unabated. For every fortress destroyed, 2 more appeared the next week. The mathematics of attrition were working against Japan, and every pilot knew it. Some continued to fight with fanatical determination, believing that individual courage could somehow reverse the tide. Others grew cynical, fatalistic, flying their missions with mechanical precision but without hope. A few, very few, began to question whether the war could be won at all. These men did not speak their doubts aloud. Doubt was treason, and treason meant death. Aboard the damaged B-17, now 2 hours from base, the crew dealt with their wounded. The waist gunner, hit by shrapnel in the shoulder and chest, lay on the floor of the fuselage, his flight suit soaked with blood. The radio operator had administered morphine and applied pressure bandages, but the bleeding continued. The gunner was conscious, occasionally lucid, asking questions that the radio operator answered with lies. "You're going to be fine. We're almost home. Doc will fix you up." The truth was more complicated. The nearest hospital was at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, still 90 minutes away, and the gunner had lost a significant amount of blood. He might survive if they reached base quickly. He might not. The radio operator held his hand and kept talking. Anything to keep him conscious, to keep him fighting. In the cockpit, the pilot pushed the remaining 3 engines as hard as he dared, trading fuel efficiency for speed, gambling that they had enough gas to make it. The Pacific Ocean below was beautiful and merciless, an expanse of blue that stretched to every horizon, dotted occasionally with clouds that cast shadows on the water. The crew members, not actively working their stations, stared down at it, contemplating what would happen if they had to ditch. The B-17 could land on water. This had been proven multiple times, but the survival rate was poor. The bomber would float for perhaps 3 minutes before the weight of the engines dragged the nose down and the aircraft sank. 3 minutes to evacuate 10 men through hatches and windows, to deploy life rafts, to gather emergency supplies. 3 minutes while wounded men struggled to move, while equipment shifted and blocked exits, while water rushed in. And even if the crew made it out, even if they reached the life rafts, their chances of rescue in the vast Pacific were minimal. The ocean kept its dead. The crew did not discuss this. They monitored their fuel gauges and prayed. The site of home base, Henderson Field's runway carved into the coral of Guadalcanal, or the longer strip at Espiritu Santo, provoked emotions that ranged from relief to something approaching religious ecstasy. The pilot called the tower, reported his status, aircraft damaged, wounded aboard, requesting priority landing. The tower cleared all other traffic, activated the crash crews, alerted the medical teams. The bomber began its descent, the pilot nursing it down carefully, aware that his hydraulic system was compromised, that his landing gear might not deploy fully, that his flaps might not extend. The flight engineer cranked the emergency gear extension system, a manual process that required 50 turns of a hand crank. The main gear locked down. The nose gear extended but did not show a locked indication. "We'll find out when we land," the pilot said, his voice calm, professional, betraying nothing of what he felt. The approach was shallow and fast. Without flaps, the bomber came in at 120 miles per hour instead of the usual 90. The runway appeared below them, growing larger, the white coral bright in the afternoon sun. The pilot flared, pulling back on the yoke, bleeding off speed. The main gear touched, bounced once, settled. The nose dropped. The nose gear held. The pilot applied brakes, what brakes remained functional, and the bomber rolled down the runway, slowing, finally stopping 3/4 of the way down the strip. Fire trucks and ambulances raced toward them. The crew sat motionless for a moment, stunned by the simple fact of survival, then began the shutdown checklist. Engines off, electrical systems off, fuel valves closed. The waste hatch opened and medics climbed in, rushing to the wounded gunner. They lifted him onto a stretcher, carried him out, loaded him into an ambulance that sped away toward the field hospital. The rest of the crew climbed out slowly, stiffly, their legs shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. They gathered on the wing, looking back at their aircraft. The damage was worse than they had realized. The fuselage was stitched with bullet holes, hundreds of them, some no larger than a pencil, others big enough to put a fist through. The right wing had a jagged tear 3 feet long where a cannon shell had passed completely through the structure. The No. 2 engine cowling was blackened from fire. Hydraulic fluid and fuel had leaked and frozen along the belly, forming a dark stain. The tail section looked like it had been attacked with a sledgehammer. The aluminum skin dimpled and torn. The rudder fabric shredded. The ground crew chief walked around the aircraft, shaking his head, making notes on a clipboard. "She'll fly again," he said. Though it would take a week of repair work, replacement parts scavenged from other damaged bombers, and the labor of mechanics working 16-hour shifts in the tropical heat. The B-17 could absorb punishment, but someone had to put it back together afterward. The mechanics were as essential to the bomber's legend as the men who flew it. The debriefing took place in the operations tent, where intelligence officers questioned each crew member separately, compiling reports that would be forwarded up the chain of command and eventually synthesized into tactical assessments and target planning. The pilot described the bomb run, the flak intensity, the fighter attacks. The bombardier reported hits on the target, though without reconnaissance photographs the actual damage remained uncertain. The gunners reported their claims. The dorsal gunner believed he had shot down 2 Zeros and damaged a 3rd. The ball turret gunner claimed one confirmed kill. The tail gunner also claimed one. The intelligence officer noted each claim with professional skepticism. Gun camera footage, when it existed, often contradicted pilot reports. A fighter smoking and diving was not necessarily destroyed. Japanese pilots were skilled at feigning damage to escape. The intelligence officer thanked each man, told them to get food and rest, dismissed them. The crew walked to the mess tent, ate without tasting the food, then found their cots in the tent city that sprawled behind the airfield. Most fell asleep immediately, still wearing their flight suits. Some lay awake, replaying the mission, thinking about the wounded gunner, wondering if he would survive. The human cost of strategic bombing defies easy quantification, resists reduction to statistics. The U.S. Army Air Forces lost 4,154 B-17s to all causes during World War II, approximately 40% of total production. Each loss represented not merely the destruction of a $238,000 machine, but the death or capture of 10 men. Each one someone's son or brother or husband, each one trained at enormous expense, each one irreplaceable in the immediate term. The Air Force calculated that it cost approximately $100,000 to train a single bomber crew to operational readiness. Flight school, gunnery training, navigation school, bombardier training, crew formation, tactical instruction. Multiply by 10, multiply by 4,754, and the human and financial investment lost becomes staggering. Yet the Americans continued to produce and train replacements faster than the losses accumulated. In 1943 alone, the training pipeline graduated over 65,000 aircrew members. The war consumed them, and the factories and schools produced more. The psychiatric casualties were less visible but equally real. The Army Air Forces did not use the term combat fatigue or battle exhaustion consistently. Different units employed different terminology, and the stigma attached to mental breakdown meant that many cases went unreported or were classified as other ailments. But the condition was ubiquitous. Men who flew 20, 30, 40 missions exhibited symptoms that ranged from insomnia and nightmares to complete psychotic breaks. Some developed uncontrollable tremors. Some became unable to board the aircraft, their bodies physically rejecting the command to return to combat. Some simply stopped functioning, sitting in their bunks, staring at nothing, unreachable. The standard tour of duty in the Pacific Theater was 50 missions, later reduced to 35, then 30. Many men did not complete their tours. They were quietly removed from flight status, sent to rear area hospitals, given sedatives and rest, and if they recovered, reassigned to non-combat duties. Some never recovered. The B-17 protected its crews from enemy fire as well as any aircraft could, but it could not protect them from the accumulating psychological weight of repeated exposure to lethal violence. The Japanese suffered parallel trauma, though their military culture provided no vocabulary for discussing it and no systems for treating it. Japanese pilots were expected to fight until victorious or dead. Any third option was dishonor. When pilots returned from missions against B-17 formations, having failed to stop the bombers, having watched their comrades shot down, having expended all ammunition with insufficient results, they reported to their superior officers with shame. Some requested permission to attempt ramming attacks on future missions, the only certain way to destroy a fortress if guns failed. Some of these requests were granted. The pilot would make a final attack run, accelerate to maximum speed, and deliberately collide with the bomber, trading his life for the lives of the American crew and the destruction of one aircraft. The mathematics favored this exchange from Japan's perspective. 1 fighter and 1 pilot lost, 10 enemy crew, and 1 heavy bomber destroyed. But the supply of pilots willing to die was not infinite, and the supply of American bombers was effectively unlimited. Desperation tactics could not substitute for industrial capacity. The letters home from both American and Japanese airmen reveal the psychological commonality of men in combat, regardless of nation or cause. An American waist gunner wrote to his mother in Iowa, "We flew another mission today. I cannot tell you where or what we hit. The sensors would cut it out. I can tell you I am well, I am eating enough, I am not wounded. I think of home every day. I think of the farm and the way the fields look in October. I will see them again. I have to believe that." A Japanese Zero pilot wrote to his family in Kyushu, Today, we engaged the enemy bombers again. They are very difficult to destroy. I did my best. I will continue to do my best for the Emperor and for Japan. Please do not worry about me. Please take care of the cherry tree I planted before I left. I want to see it bloom again." Both men were killed within a month of writing these letters. The American died when his B-17 was shot down over Wewak. The Japanese died when his Zero was struck by defensive fire from a fortress over Rabaul. The war did not care about cherry trees or Iowa farmland. By mid-1944, the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted decisively against Japan, and the B-17, though still operational, had been largely superseded by newer aircraft better suited to the vast distances and evolving tactical requirements of the theater. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, larger, faster, more heavily armed, and capable of flying at altitudes above 30,000 feet beyond the reach of most Japanese fighters, became the primary instrument of the American strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. The B-17, meanwhile, continued to serve in secondary roles: anti-submarine patrol, maritime reconnaissance, air-sea rescue equipped with lifeboats to be dropped to downed airmen. Some B-17s were transferred to the China-Burma-India theater, where they bombed Japanese installations in Southeast Asia. Others were sent to Europe, where the air war against Germany had consumed thousands of heavy bombers and constantly demanded replacements. The Pacific B-17s, worn and battle-damaged, veterans of dozens of missions, flew their final sorties and were either scrapped or converted to transport and training use. Irony of the B-17's Pacific service is that it succeeded in its mission despite never being ideally suited for the theater. The aircraft had been designed in 1935 to defend the American coastline by attacking enemy invasion fleets, a mission it never performed in actual combat. Instead, it became a strategic bomber, flying long-range missions against land targets over an ocean so vast that navigation errors of a few degrees could mean the difference between returning to base and vanishing without a trace. The B-17's range, impressive for its era, was barely adequate for Pacific operations. Missions frequently pushed the aircraft to the limits of its fuel capacity, forcing pilots to choose between carrying maximum bombs or maximum fuel, between completing the bombing run and having enough gas to return home. The B-24 Liberator, with its greater range, was arguably better suited to the Pacific, yet the B-17 earned a reputation for survivability that the B-24 never matched. Crews trusted the Fortress. They believed it would bring them home, and often, against all odds, it did. The statistics of the Pacific Air War tell a story of grinding attrition on both sides, but with a critical asymmetry in the ability to sustain losses. From 1942 through 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces in the Pacific lost approximately 400 B-17s to all causes: enemy action, mechanical failure, weather, operational accidents. In the same period, Japan lost over 15,000 aircraft of all types, including fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, and trainers. The American losses were painful but sustainable. The Japanese losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. By 1945, the Japanese had resorted to training pilots with fewer than 50 hours of flight time, sending them into combat against American airmen who had hundreds of hours of training and months of combat experience. The outcome of individual engagements became predictable. A novice Japanese pilot in a Zero, no matter how brave, could not compete with an experienced American fighter pilot in a P-38 or F-6F. And the bombers, protected by these fighters, by their own defensive armament, and by the sheer depth of American resources, continued their missions unabated. The Japanese home islands, by late 1944, lay within range of American B-29s operating from bases in the Mariana Islands. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan escalated from precision strikes on military and industrial targets to area bombing of cities, culminating in the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. The B-17, by this point, had become a footnote in the Pacific War, its role absorbed by newer aircraft, its crews rotated home or reassigned. But the lessons learned in the early years of the Pacific Campaign, the importance of defensive armament, the value of survivability over speed, The psychological impact of a bomber that refused to fall shaped American heavy bomber doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. The fortress concept, refined through bitter experience, became the foundation upon which American strategic air power was built. The mythology of the flying fortress, constructed during the war through official propaganda, newsreel footage, and the stories told by returning airmen, solidified in the post-war years into cultural legend. The B-17 became the symbol of American air power in World War II, more famous than the arguably superior B-24, more iconic than the B-29 despite the latter's role in ending the war. Hollywood embraced the fortress. Films like 12 O'Clock High and Memphis Belle dramatized the experiences of bomber crews, emphasizing courage, sacrifice, and the bond between men facing death together. These films were not entirely inaccurate. The bomber crews did display extraordinary courage, did face death repeatedly, did rely on each other for survival, but they simplified and sanitized the reality of strategic bombing, omitting the moral ambiguity of dropping high explosives on targets that might contain civilians, glossing over the physical and psychological destruction that combat inflicted on the men who flew. The B-17 veterans, returning home in 1945 and 1946, found themselves both celebrated and alienated. The public wanted to hear heroic stories, tales of bombers shot full of holes yet somehow making it home, of gunners who had shot down multiple enemy fighters, of crews who had completed their tours and survived. Some veterans told these stories, polished and rehearsed, suitable for civic gatherings and veterans organizations. Others found they could not speak of their experiences at all, could not convey the terror of being trapped in a freezing metal tube while fighters attacked and flak exploded around them, could not explain what it felt like to drop bombs and then see the explosions below and know that people were dying because of your actions. These men stayed silent, retreated into private life, carried their memories alone. The dichotomy between the public mythology and the private reality created a gulf that many veterans never successfully bridged. The Japanese veterans faced different but parallel challenges. In the immediate post-war period, Japan's military past was a source of shame, associated with defeat and occupation and the atomic bombings that had destroyed two cities. The pilots who had fought against the B-17s, who had survived when so many of their comrades had died, returned to a country that did not want to hear about their experiences. Some wrote memoirs years or decades later, attempting to make sense of what they had lived through. Saburo Sakai's memoir, Samurai, published in 1957, described his encounters with flying fortresses with a mixture of respect and frustration. They were difficult to shoot down, he wrote, not because their pilots were especially skilled, but because the aircraft itself was so strongly built and so heavily armed. We learned to respect the B-17 even as we cursed it. Other Japanese pilots never spoke publicly about the war, their silence a form of mourning for a lost world, for the comrades who had died, for the empire that had sent them into battles they could not win. The mechanics and ground crews who had maintained the B-17s, whose labor was essential to keeping the bombers flying, received far less attention in the post-war mythology. Yet their contribution was immense. A B-17 required approximately 350 man-hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time. Engines had to be serviced, oil changed, spark plugs cleaned or replaced. Hydraulic systems had to be inspected for leaks. Electrical systems tested. Guns cleaned, ammunition belts loaded, battle damage repaired, holes patched, cables spliced, control surfaces straightened or replaced. The mechanics worked in brutal conditions. Tropical heat on Pacific islands, freezing cold in the Aleutians, always under pressure to get aircraft back into service as quickly as possible. They worked with inadequate tools, insufficient spare parts, improvising solutions when official repair manuals offered no guidance. When a B-17 returned from a mission and landed safely, the credit went to the pilot and crew. But the mechanics knew that their work had made that landing possible, that without their expertise and dedication, the bomber would never have left the ground in the first place. The technical evolution of the B-17 from its initial design in 1935 to the final G model in 1943 represents a case study in iterative engineering under combat conditions. Each variant incorporated lessons learned from previous models, each modification addressing a specific vulnerability or operational requirement identified in actual combat. The B-17C, deployed in small numbers to the Philippines in 1941, revealed the inadequacy of handheld defensive guns and the need for armor protection. The B-17E, introduced in 1942, added the tail gun position, expanded defensive armament to 10 machine guns, and incorporated a redesigned tail section that improved stability. The B-17F, which became the most produced variant with 3,405 aircraft built, featured upgraded engines, increased fuel capacity, and a frameless plexiglass nose cone that improved the bombardier's visibility. The final variant, the B-17G, addressed the bomber's most persistent vulnerability: frontal attacks. By adding a chin turret with twin 50-caliber guns beneath the nose, the G model eliminated the forward blind spot and made head-on attacks suicidally dangerous for fighter pilots. Each of these modifications required not merely engineering redesign, but extensive testing, production retooling, and crew retraining. Boeing's Seattle plant, Douglas's Long Beach facility, and Lockheed Vega's Burbank factory coordinated production schedules, shared tooling, and implemented changes across thousands of aircraft already in various stages of assembly. The logistics were staggering. A single B-17 contained over 140,000 individual parts, required 47,000 rivets, used 12,500 pounds of aluminum, and incorporated components manufactured by over 600 subcontractors spread across the United States. When a design change was approved, adding a chin turret, for example, it rippled through the entire supply chain, requiring new part specifications, new assembly procedures, new quality control standards. That the production system adapted as quickly as it did, incorporating major design changes without halting the production line for more than brief periods, testified to American industrial capacity and organizational sophistication. The cost of this industrial effort was borne by the American economy and ultimately the American taxpayer, though few civilians fully grasped the scale of expenditure. The entire B-17 program, from initial design through final production, cost approximately $3 billion in 1940s dollars, equivalent to over $50 billion in 2025 currency. This included not merely the cost of the aircraft themselves, but the factories built to produce them, the tools and dies required for manufacturing, the training facilities for crews, the spare parts pipelines, the maintenance infrastructure. The B-17 represented a massive bet that strategic bombing would be decisive in winning the war, that the investment would pay off in military victory and saved lives. Whether this bet was justified remains debated by historians. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany destroyed cities and industrial capacity, but did not break German morale or prevent war production from continuing until nearly the end of the war. In the Pacific, strategic bombing played a more decisive role, isolating Japan from resources, destroying its ability to wage war, and ultimately compelling surrender. But the human cost, on both sides, was immense. The irony is that the B-17, designed as a defensive weapon to protect American shores from invasion, became an offensive weapon that carried the war to the enemy's homeland. It was used in ways its designers never anticipated, against targets they never imagined, in a conflict that transformed the nature of warfare itself. The strategic bombing campaigns of World War II established the template for Cold War nuclear strategy. The idea that wars could be won by destroying an enemy's industrial capacity and civilian morale through air power alone, without the need for armies to meet in ground combat. This idea proved both powerful and dangerous, leading to arms races, proxy wars, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The B-17 was a child of its time, a product of 1930s thinking about air warfare, but its legacy extended far beyond its operational service, shaping military doctrine and strategic thinking for generations. The individual stories of B-17 crews who flew in the Pacific theater reveal patterns of experience that transcend the particular details of names and dates. There was the crew of the Tokyo Taxi, a B-17E based at Guadalcanal, who flew 32 missions without a single crew casualty, an almost miraculous record in a theater where losses ran as high as 5% per mission. Their survival was attributed to a combination of skill, caution, and extraordinary luck. The pilot, Captain James T. Murphy, was known for his methodical approach to missions. He studied intelligence reports obsessively, planned contingencies for every possible failure, drilled his crew on emergency procedures until they could execute them in darkness or under fire without conscious thought. When asked about his secret, Murphy shrugged. "There is no secret," he said. "You do everything right, and you hope that's enough." Sometimes it isn't. Murphy completed his tour, rotated home, survived the war, and died in a car accident in 1952, 7 years after the fighting ended. There was the crew of Southern Comfort, a B-17F that ditched in the Pacific after running out of fuel on the return from a mission to Rabaul. The bomber floated for nearly 4 minutes, longer than expected, giving the crew time to evacuate and deploy their life rafts. They drifted for 6 days, 9 men in 2 rafts, rationing water and emergency rations, watching the empty horizon for rescue aircraft that did not come. 2 men died of exposure on the 4th day. The remaining 7 were spotted by a Navy PBY Catalina flying boat on the 6th day and rescued. They were emaciated, severely sunburned, half delirious from dehydration. 3 spent weeks in the hospital recovering. 4 eventually returned to flight status. The pilot never flew combat again. He was reassigned to training duties stateside, where he taught new pilots navigation and fuel management, hoping his experience could prevent other crews from suffering the same fate. There was the crew of Hell's Angels, one of the most famous B-17s in the Pacific, which completed 48 missions, an exceptional number for that theater and time period. The aircraft became something of a good luck charm, and crews considered it an honor to fly on it. Its survival was attributed partly to the skill of its regular crew, but also to the meticulous maintenance provided by its dedicated ground crew, led by Master Sergeant Ernest Holmes, who treated the bomber as if it were a living thing that required care and respect. Holmes inspected every rivet, every cable, every component after each mission. He rejected replacement parts if they didn't meet his standards, even if it meant delaying the aircraft's return to service. His obsessive attention paid off. Hell's Angels survived the war and was eventually returned to the United States, where it was displayed at air shows and eventually placed in a museum. Holmes attended the dedication ceremony in 1946. He stood before the aircraft, ran his hand along the aluminum skin, and wept. And there was the crew of the Last Straw, a B-17G that flew its first mission in December 1944 and was shot down on its second. The bomber was struck by anti-aircraft fire over truck, the shell exploding in the bomb bay and igniting the remaining bombs. The aircraft disintegrated in mid-air, breaking into 3 sections, all of which fell into the ocean. 6 crew members died in the explosion. 3 were thrown clear and survived the fall, 2 with parachutes, 1 without, landing in the water. The man without a parachute, the ball turret gunner, somehow survived the impact with the ocean, suffering multiple fractures and internal injuries. He was rescued by a submarine that happened to be patrolling nearby. He spent 8 months in hospitals, underwent multiple surgeries, was eventually medically discharged. He returned to civilian life in Michigan, where he worked as a machinist, married, raised 3 children, and never spoke about the war to anyone, including his family. His grandchildren learned about his service only after he died, when they found his medals and discharge papers in a trunk in his attic. The Pacific Theater's geographic challenges created unique operational demands that pushed the B-17 to the limits of its design parameters and forced crews to develop techniques and procedures not covered in any training manual. The distances involved were staggering. From Guadalcanal to Rabaul was over 400 miles. From Espiritu Santo to Truk, over 1,200 miles. From bases in China to targets in Formosa, over 1,000 miles. These were not the relatively short hops of the European theater, where bases in England might be 300 miles from targets in Germany. Pacific missions could last 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours, with the majority of that time spent over open, Ocean where navigation errors meant death and mechanical. Failures meant ditching in waters where rescue was. Improbable. The navigators carried the burden of this geography. Their tools were primitive by modern standards. A sextant for celestial navigation, a drift meter for calculating wind speed and direction, charts that were often inaccurate, dead reckoning calculations that accumulated error with each passing mile. Over land, a navigator could confirm position by identifying landmarks, rivers, mountains, cities. Over the Pacific, there were no landmarks, only water, featureless and uniform, offering no clues to position. The navigator would take sextant sightings on the sun or stars, calculate latitude and longitude, plot the results on his chart, and hope he had done the math correctly. A 1-degree error in celestial navigation could translate to a 60-mile position error. At the end of a 10-hour mission with the aircraft low on fuel, a 60-mile error could mean the difference between landing safely and running out of gas before reaching the airfield. The weather added another layer of danger. The Pacific spawned typhoons, massive rotating storm systems with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour, capable of tearing aircraft apart. Meteorological forecasting in the 1940s was rudimentary, based on scattered weather observations from ships and islands, with no satellite imagery or computer modeling. Bomber crews frequently encountered weather that had not been predicted, flying into thunderstorms that tossed the heavy aircraft like toys, that iced up wings and control surfaces, that created turbulence so severe that crew members were thrown against bulkheads despite their safety straps. Some aircraft were lost to weather, struck by lightning, torn apart by wind shear, iced so heavily they could no longer maintain altitude and spiraled into the ocean. These losses did not appear in combat statistics, were not attributed to enemy action, but they were casualties of the war nonetheless. The isolation of Pacific bases meant that crews lived in conditions that ranged from austere to primitive. The airfields carved into coral atolls or jungle clearings offered minimal amenities, tents for housing, mess halls serving monotonous food, outdoor latrines, no fresh water beyond what could be collected from rain or distilled from seawater. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and other tropical diseases were endemic. The heat and humidity rotted clothing, corroded equipment, bred mold and fungus. Morale was maintained through small comforts, mail from home, occasional movies shown on improvised screens, the camaraderie of men who depended on each other for survival. But the strain of living in such conditions, combined with the stress of repeated combat missions, wore men down. Some crews counted days until they could rotate home. Others tried not to count at all, living mission to mission, day to day, not looking beyond the immediate horizon because the future was too uncertain to contemplate. The final year of the Pacific War saw the B-17's role diminish as newer aircraft assumed the strategic bombing mission. Yet the lessons learned from its service shaped the endgame of the conflict in ways both obvious and subtle. The crews who had flown fortresses in 1942 and 1943, who had survived their tours and rotated home, became instructors, passing their hard-won knowledge to the next generation of airmen who would fly B-29s, B-24s, and eventually the jet bombers of the post-war era. They taught not merely technical skills, how to fly formation, how to operate the bomb sight, how to maintain fire discipline, but something more intangible, the mindset required to survive strategic bombing, the ability to compartmentalize fear, to function while terrified, to make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information under extreme stress. These were not skills that could be taught in a classroom. They were learned only through experience, through surviving missions that should have been fatal, through watching friends die and continuing to fly the next day. The Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after Japan's surrender, attempted to quantify the effectiveness of the air campaign, to measure in tons of bombs dropped and targets destroyed whether the massive investment in heavy bombers had been justified. The numbers were impressive in their scale. Over 160,000 tons of bombs dropped on Japanese targets, thousands of square miles of cities destroyed, industrial production crippled, transportation networks severed. But the survey also revealed uncomfortable truths. Much of the bombing had been inaccurate, particularly in the early years. Many targets survived multiple raids. The Japanese had demonstrated remarkable resilience, dispersing production, working around destroyed infrastructure, maintaining military resistance even as their cities burned. The strategic bombing campaign had ultimately succeeded not because it was surgically precise, but because it was overwhelming, because the Americans could sustain losses and continue operations while Japan could not. The B-17's contribution to this outcome was significant but not decisive. It had proven the concept, validated the doctrine, and paid for both with the blood of its crews. The Japanese perspective on the strategic bombing campaign reveals a different understanding of the B-17's impact. To American planners, the bomber was a tool for destroying military and industrial targets. To Japanese civilians living beneath the flight paths, it was an agent of terror, a harbinger of death that could appear at any moment, against which there was no effective defense. Air raid shelters offered minimal protection against 500-pound bombs. Fighter defenses by 1944 had been depleted to the point of irrelevance. The sound of air raid sirens became the soundtrack of daily life in Japanese-held territories. And the sight of bomber formations, whether B-17s, B-24s, or B-29s, provoked not merely fear, but a kind of fatalistic resignation. The war was lost. Everyone knew it. But it continued, grinding forward with mechanical inevitability, because surrender was unthinkable and resistance, however futile, was obligatory. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, delivered by B-29s, marked the culmination of the strategic bombing doctrine that the B-17 had helped pioneer. The logic was consistent. If conventional bombs could destroy cities block by block, then atomic bombs could destroy them instantaneously, with proportionally greater impact on enemy morale and will to resist. The reality was more complicated. Japan surrendered not merely because of the atomic bombs, but because of the totality of its defeat, the destruction of its navy, the isolation of its armies, the Soviet declaration of war, the complete collapse of any hope for favorable terms. But the atomic bombs provided a face-saving narrative. Japan had not been defeated by superior courage or fighting spirit, but by a weapon against which no defense was possible. A force of nature rather than a human enemy. The B-17, humble and obsolete by war's end, had helped create the conditions that made this ending possible. The human reckoning came slowly, in the years and decades after the war ended, as veterans attempted to reconcile what they had done with who they understood themselves to be. The B-17 crews had flown missions knowing that their bombs would kill people, enemy soldiers, certainly, but also civilians who happened to live near military targets, who worked in factories, who could not evacuate or chose not to. The moral weight of this knowledge varied among individuals. Some viewed it through the lens of military necessity. The enemy had started the war, had committed atrocities, and deserved whatever destruction came to them. Others struggled with more ambiguous feelings, recognizing that the people they killed, Japanese soldiers and civilians, were human beings with families and hopes, and no more choice about being born Japanese than the Americans had about being born American. These men carried guilt that never entirely dissipated, that colored their post-war lives in ways their families often did not understand. The reunion of the 43rd Bombardment Group, held annually beginning in 1950, provided a space where veterans could speak of things they could not discuss elsewhere. At these gatherings, in hotel ballrooms and VFW halls, men who had not seen each other in years would embrace, would drink too much, would stay up late telling stories that started funny and ended dark. They spoke of missions that had gone wrong, of friends who had died, of the randomness of survival, how a burst of flak that killed one man would have killed you instead if you had been standing 6 inches to the left, how a fighter attack that destroyed one bomber had missed yours because the pilot banked at exactly the right moment. How your life had been saved by 1,000 small chances that could easily have gone the other way. They spoke of the Japanese pilots, too, with a respect that might have seemed strange to outsiders. Those men had been trying to kill them, and they had been trying to kill those men. But there was a fellowship in having shared the experience of aerial combat, of having faced death in the sky, that transcended national boundaries. The Japanese veterans, When they finally began to speak publicly in the 1960s and 1970s, expressed similar sentiments. Saburo Sakai, in his later years, met with American pilots who had flown in the Pacific, including some who had flown B-17s. The meetings were cordial, even warm. They compared notes on tactics, on aircraft performance, on shared experiences. Sakai would describe his attacks on flying fortresses, the difficulty of bringing them down, the frustration of seeing them continue, despite taking what should have been fatal damage. The American pilots would nod, understanding. They had been inside those bombers, had felt them shudder from hits, had wondered if the next shell would be the one that killed them. But their aircraft had held together, had brought them home. Sakai would smile, a sad smile, and say that the Americans had built their bombers very well. It was not an admission of defeat, not quite. It was an acknowledgement of reality, that engineering and industrial capacity had mattered more than courage, and that Japan had lost because it could not match America's ability to produce machines and train men. The children and grandchildren of B-17 crews often grew up hearing fragments of stories, pieces of the war that their fathers or grandfathers would occasionally mention, usually triggered by something innocuous. A sound, a smell, a news report. The veterans would begin a story, then stop mid-sentence, their eyes distant, and say, "Never mind," or "It doesn't matter now." What they could not convey was the sensory totality of the experience, the cold at altitude, so intense it hurt to breathe, the smell of the aircraft, a mixture of oil and sweat and fear. The sound of the engines, a roar that penetrated your skull and stayed with you even after you landed. The sight of another bomber falling on fire, knowing that men you had eaten breakfast with were dying, and there was nothing you could do. These memories were not narratives with beginnings and ends. They were visceral, embodied, resistant to language. And so they remained largely unspoken, carried in silence until death released them. The technological legacy of the B-17 extended far beyond its operational service, influencing aircraft design and military doctrine for decades. The lessons learned from the Fortress, the importance of defensive armament, the value of redundant systems, the need for crew protection, were incorporated into every subsequent American heavy bomber. The B-29, though significantly more advanced, retained the fundamental philosophy that had guided B-17 design, that a bomber should be able to defend itself, that its crew's survival should be a primary design consideration, that resilience mattered as much as performance. This philosophy diverged sharply from Soviet and later British approaches, which often prioritized speed and altitude over defensive capability, accepting higher loss rates in exchange for greater offensive potential. The American approach was more expensive, more complex, but it reflected a democratic society's reluctance to treat its soldiers as expendable resources. The Cold War bomber force, the B-36, the B-47, the B-52, represented the evolution of strategic bombing doctrine into the nuclear age, but the conceptual lineage traced directly back to the B-17. The idea that wars could be won through air power alone, that strategic bombing could compel enemy surrender without the need for ground invasion, became foundational to American military planning. This doctrine was tested and found wanting in Korea, where strategic bombing failed to break North Korean and Chinese will to fight. It was tested again in Vietnam, where the most intensive bombing campaign in history failed to prevent communist victory. Yet the doctrine persisted, refined and modified but never abandoned, because it offered a seductive promise that American technological superiority could substitute for American casualties, that wars could be won from the air cleanly and decisively. The B-17 had not created this promise. Air power enthusiasts had been making similar claims since the 1920s, but it had seemed to validate it, at least partially, in the victory over Japan. The preservation of B-17s as museum pieces and flying exhibits represents an attempt to maintain physical connection to this history, to keep the aircraft and its story accessible to generations who did not experience the war. Approximately 15 B-17s remain in flying condition as of 2025, maintained by museums and private organizations at enormous expense. These aircraft fly at air shows, offer rides to paying passengers, serve as educational tools. When they fly, people stop and watch, drawn by the sound of their engines and the sight of their distinctive silhouette. For veterans who flew them, seeing a B-17 in flight can be overwhelming, triggering memories both cherished and traumatic. For younger generations, the aircraft is a curiosity, a relic from a different era, as remote and foreign as a medieval castle. The gap between the lived experience of war and the sanitized remembrance of it widens with each passing year. The scholarship on the B-17 and strategic bombing continues to evolve, as historians gain access to previously classified documents and as new interpretive frameworks are applied to old questions. Recent work has emphasized the moral complexities of strategic bombing, the indiscriminate nature of area bombing campaigns, the civilian casualties that were euphemistically described as collateral damage. These critiques do not diminish the courage of the men who flew the bombers. Courage and moral culpability are not mutually exclusive, but they complicate the heroic narratives that dominated post-war memory. The B-17 crews were brave. They were also participants in campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Both things can be true. The challenge for contemporary understanding is to hold these truths in tension without collapsing into either simplistic condemnation or uncritical celebration. The end of the B-17's combat service came not with drama, but with bureaucratic efficiency, as surplus aircraft were systematically disposed of in the years following Japan's surrender. Thousands of bombers, declared excess to peacetime requirements, were flown to storage facilities in the American Southwest, where the dry climate prevented corrosion. They were parked in neat rows, wingtip to wingtip, covering hundreds of acres. Some were eventually sold to civilian operators, converted to cargo aircraft or aerial firefighting platforms. Most were scrapped, their aluminum melted down and recycled, their engines salvaged for parts. The wholesale destruction of B-17s, aircraft that had survived combat, that had brought their crews home despite catastrophic damage, proceeded with industrial efficiency. By 1960, fewer than 50 intact B-17s existed worldwide. The fortress had been rendered obsolete not by enemy action, but by technological progress and budgetary constraints. The men who had flown these aircraft dispersed into civilian life, carrying with them memories and trauma and skills that did not always translate to peacetime employment. Some became commercial pilots, finding that flying airliners offered a pale echo of the intensity they had experienced in combat. Others avoided aviation entirely, unable to reconcile the cockpit with the memories it triggered. Many struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, suffering nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, and emotional numbing. The Veterans Administration provided minimal support for psychological casualties. The prevailing attitude held that real men should be able to handle their problems without help. Some veterans self-medicated with alcohol, some isolated themselves from family and community, some functioned adequately in daily life, while carrying an interior weight that never lifted, and some thrived finding purpose in work and family, integrating their war experience into a coherent life narrative that acknowledged both the horror and the meaning of what they had endured. The Japanese pilots faced different challenges in post-war Japan. The occupation by American forces, the reconstruction of a shattered nation, the repudiation of militarism as national policy, all of this rendered their wartime service problematic. They had fought bravely for a cause that their country now rejected, had risked their lives in service of an empire that had brought ruin upon its people. Some found work as commercial pilots for Japan's rebuilding airlines. Others left aviation entirely, becoming farmers, businessmen, teachers. A few maintained connection to their wartime service through veterans organizations, though these groups were viewed with suspicion by many Japanese who associated them with the militarism that had led to war. The pilots who had fought against the B-17, who had watched in frustration as the fortresses absorbed damage and flew on, carried their own complicated memories, pride in their skill and courage, grief for their lost comrades, and a recognition that they had been participants in a conflict that should never have been fought. The generational transfer of memory accelerated in the 1990s and 2000s as the World War II veteran population aged and died. Veterans who had maintained decades of silence about their experiences began to speak, motivated by a desire to leave some record before it was too late. Oral history projects collected thousands of interviews. Museums recorded testimonies. Families gathered around aging men and listened to stories that had never been told. The accounts were often fragmentary, jumping between topics, mixing profound observations with mundane details. The coffee was terrible. I was afraid every single mission. We lost a lot of good men. I'd do it again if I had to. The contradictions were not resolved because they could not be resolved. War was terrible and necessary, traumatic and formative, something to be regretted and something to be proud of. The B-17 veterans in their final years understood this complexity better than anyone. The Flying Fortress exists now primarily as symbol and memory, its material reality reduced to a handful of museum exhibits and airworthy survivors. Its historical reality accessible only through documents and photographs and the fading testimonies of those who knew it in service. What endures is the story, a narrative of American industrial might, of technological innovation in service of strategic goals, of ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances and performing with courage and competence. This story has been told and retold in documentaries and books and museums until it has acquired the quality of myth. And like all myths, it contains truth wrapped in simplification, meaning obscured by the accretions of subsequent interpretation. The truth is that the B-17 was a good aircraft, well designed for its mission but not a miracle machine. It could be destroyed. It did fall from the sky carrying men to their deaths. It killed not only enemy soldiers, but civilians, women, and children who had no choice about the targets their government placed in their cities. It was a weapon of war, and war is organized violence, and violence produces trauma and death, regardless of how nobly its purpose is framed. The men who flew the B-17 were brave, but bravery does not erase moral complexity. They served their country in a war that needed fighting, against enemies who had committed genuine atrocities, but their service included acts, the dropping of bombs on populated areas, that would be reconsidered and questioned by subsequent generations. The Japanese pilots who fought against the fortresses demonstrated equal courage, equal skill, equal willingness to sacrifice. They were not monsters or fanatics, though their cause was unjust, and their nation's conduct often barbaric. They were men who believed they were defending their country, who flew obsolescent aircraft against overwhelming odds, who continued fighting long past any rational hope of victory because surrender was culturally unthinkable. When they attacked B-17 formations, when they pressed their attacks despite withering defensive fire, when they expended their ammunition and returned to base having failed to stop the bombers, they were not demonstrating the futility of courage. They were demonstrating that courage, absent adequate material resources, cannot overcome industrial and technological superiority. This was the fundamental lesson of the Pacific Air War, and it was written in the contrails of flying fortresses that refused to fall. The final accounting must acknowledge what was gained and what was lost. The B-17 helped win a necessary war against expansionist empires that had to be stopped. The cost was measured in destroyed cities, in tens of thousands of dead crew members on both sides, in civilians killed by bombs, in psychological trauma that echoed through generations. Was it worth it? The question is unanswerable in any satisfying way. The alternative, allowing fascist and militarist powers to dominate vast regions, was unacceptable. The method, strategic bombing that deliberately or incidentally killed civilians, remains morally troubling. We are left with a paradox. The B-17 represents both American virtue, the willingness to fight tyranny, and American capacity for destruction. It saved the world and burned cities. It protected its crews and killed thousands. It was precisely what it was designed to be, a flying fortress, formidable and lethal, a machine that would not go down. And in the end, in the vast accounting of the Second World War, perhaps that was enough. The fortress stood. The crews came home, those who survived. The war was won. The world moved forward, carrying its scars, remembering imperfectly, forgetting what it could, trying to learn lessons that each generation must relearn. The B-17 is gone now mostly, except in museums and memories. but its shadow remains cast across the history of warfare, a reminder of what human beings can build and what they can endure and what they can do to each other when nations collide and the sky becomes a battlefield.